Namaste, and welcome to tonight's program of Living Wisely, Living Well. I'd like to begin by playing a simple chant of Paramahansa Yogananda's to get us started. I am Om, I am Om, I am Om, I am Om, I am Om. Omnipresent I am Om, all-pervading I am Om, all-blessed I am Om. Om, Om, come to me, come to me, oh, come to me. Om, Om, come to me, come to me, oh, come to me. I am Om, I am Om, I am Om, I am Om. Omnipresent I am Om, all-pervading I am Om, all-blessed I am Om. Om, Om, come to me, come to me, oh, come to me. Om, Om, come to me, come to me, oh, come to me. Om, Om, come to me, come to me, oh, come to me. Om, 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 Welcome again to this evening's program on Living Wisely, Living Well. Every week we take the day's reading from this book, and today's is a very simple one. It's a short one. Short but not simple, I think, when we begin to explore more deeply into it. Swami Kriyananda writes in today's reading, wrap yourself in a cloak of calmness. A calm, wisely guided will is the best protection against adversity. Now, this is a very short one, and so I thought to supplement it with Swami Kriyananda's writing on the topic of calmness from his book, Affirmations for Self-Healing. And he says in this one about this topic of calmness, which we're going to address this evening, calmness is perfectly achieved when life's little wave becomes absorbed into the cosmic sea, in divine ecstasy. In daily life, too, we can achieve calmness to a degree by keeping our awareness focused on the reality of the spirit underlying all outward circumstances. Calmness comes with the determination to live ever happily in the present moment, relinquishing the past and not worrying about the future, but placing our lives firmly in God's hands, and that knowing He is fully in command. Calmness comes with non-attachment, with knowing that nothing in this world is truly ours. This topic of calmness is something I think all of us know about in our daily experiences in life. And I thought of it, this chant that I began this evening's discourse with, I am Om, in regard to this topic of calmness. And it reminded me of that story of Dr. Lewis when he went out sailing in the ocean off the coast of New England, Massachusetts, that area of the United States in the early 1920s. And he went out and he ran into a storm, and he had a very small sailboat, and he ran into a very violent storm that came up very suddenly, caught him out on the ocean. And he felt his life was in danger, that the boat was going to capsize. The waves became very high. The wind was very violently blowing. And he tied everything down and he got into the bottom of a boat, and he remembered something that Paramahansa Yogananda, his guru, had told him. He says, in the times of great adversity and trouble, and as a matter of fact, at all times in life, if possible, but especially in those times of adversity, is to put yourself into Om. Remember Om, that cosmic sound, that divine light. Remember the Om sound. And you gain that experience, of course, through daily meditation and the awareness of that through our daily spiritual practices. And so Dr. Lewis put himself in the bottom of the boat, and he remembered Om, and he looked up into the sky and he saw divine light there, a great light. And he just surrendered himself up into that light and into the cosmic sound of Om. And he found himself perfectly at ease and you might say, comforted by God's presence and knowing that he would be safe in that moment. And yes, the storm calmed after a little while, and he found himself back on shore, and he was able to sail to shore in a safe way. Interestingly, and the funny part of the story also is very shortly thereafter, when he made his way to the small cabin where he was staying, a telephone call came to him, and he picked up the telephone, and it was Master Paramahansa Yogananda, his guru, calling him at that moment. He says, Doctor, you almost got wet, didn't you? You see, and the master had known what was happening. And so that Om, you could also think perhaps it was Guru's protection at that time, protecting his devotee, because master was aware at that moment of the doctor's difficulties at that time. But this idea of putting ourselves in those times of difficulties, of adversity, yes, in the very difficult ones or the emergency situations, but also in daily life itself. Doesn't it sometimes seem like we're in the middle of a storm? The winds are blowing and howling, adversity is knocking at our door, and it seems like whatever we do, it's just one more problem after the next one, and we wonder, how am I going to navigate this? It's like a hurricane. Sometimes it's so adverse. And at those times particularly, we have to call upon God. And we have to remember that in the middle of the greatest storm, even like a hurricane, at the center of that storm, there's a calm center in the middle of that storm. And we have to put ourselves into that central spot. It's as if, the reading says, it's pulling. It's like the winds of adversity are pulling at our cloak and trying to rip us away. That cloak of calmness. It says, surround yourself, wrap yourself in that cloak of calmness. And then in that cloak of calmness, then we can face whatever life's adversity that comes to us. But wrapping yourself in that cloak of calmness is not something that's passive. It's something we have to invoke through the use of our wisdom guided will. And it says in the reading, with wisely guided will, we meet the challenges, so we meet those adversities that come to us, wisely guided will. And that by saying wisely guided will, the implication is when difficulties come to us, we cannot be passive and just ride the winds of change in a passive way. We ride the winds of change in an active way. We have to use our will, just like we could use the image of the high waves of a violent sea crashing on shore. And most times when such things happen, everybody leaves the shoreline because it's violent. But there are some. I know I grew up in an area where they're on the ocean beaches, and some people actually like those times because the waves were high. I know it'd be the people who'd like to go out into the waves and surf those waves. And life is like that. Adversity comes, and the surfer is one who enjoys the waves because he knows how to ride the waves. He goes with those waves and he doesn't resist them. And he sees adversity as actually an opportunity for him to apply himself and go with using his wisely guided will in order to conform with whatever adversity is coming to us. Because inwardly he remains calm, he remains centered, and allows what comes and navigates it appropriately. So we have to face adversity. We have to face it, and we have to use our will, and we have to resist the temptation to become, in the midst of that adversity, restless, fearful, worrisome, all of those negative reactions when adversity comes. We have to put them aside and remember and bring ourselves back to that calm center that is inside each one of us. Sometimes my tendency is to think that when adversity comes, their natural reaction of, oh my God, and then you start to fret and perhaps become upset. The heart begins to pound a little bit. Some of this is actually just a habit. It's like, oh, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. The body thinks that because the body has been trained. It's a fear or flight, perhaps, that reaction. The tiger pops out of the forest and naturally the body says, oh my God, and you begin to react that way. And pretty soon it becomes a habit. When any little bit of adversity comes, you have that same fearful reaction, and you're not in control of that. And that's just why oftentimes something happens and your reactive process takes over rather than that process of responding appropriately to whatever the situation is. And I think that's where this piece of advice of one thing we can do is whenever you feel that impulse is to count 10, as they say. And the reason they say is count 10 is don't immediately react. 1, 2, 3. And it gives you that little bit of space in order then to react appropriately. And this is precisely what the practice of meditation does for us. It begins to create that little bit of space in the midst of our daily activities, that when something that we don't like or some event happens in which we would normally react in an emotional way, it gives us a bit of distance and inserts into our consciousness a little bit of space to say, well, wait a minute, and catch that habitual reaction that tends to respond with the restlessness and with the lack of calmness. And it reminds us, no, stay in your center, stay in the midst of in that center point of calmness, and then act appropriately to what the situation is. And you find that if you act from that center of calmness, you find that your will, which is behind every action, your will has a chance to become wisely guided in your responses to life. Now, responding doesn't necessarily mean that you'll always react or respond wisely. That's another level of learning what is wise response or wise action is. But nevertheless, you give yourself a chance to wisely respond. So the question might be that for all of us, well, how do we do this? How do we stay centered in our life when adversity comes, rather than just flying off the handle or getting emotionally upset or becoming frustrated, becoming fearful, beginning to worry? How do we keep that center? Well, I've given one suggestion already, is learning to meditate, learning to be able to practice by inserting that little bit of a removal, of stepping back a little bit from life to be able to respond to it, and giving perspective of, you might say, slowing down that reactive process, the emotional reactive process, giving us a little bit of perspective. But there's a number of things that we could also add to that to be able to help us to be able to ride the winds of change. And I think one of the beginning points after meditation, you might say, is learning to identify with that still center within ourselves. And of course, this is what meditation does. Besides giving us that sense of perspective, we learn to touch a certain point of stillness, just like that eye of the hurricane. There's, in the midst of every situation, there's a certain stillness. You could say that the restlessness that comes to us, the mind all of a sudden responding to the difficulties in life of not being calm, not being centered, is like the periphery. But with a little bit of training and with understanding, we come to say in the middle of every situation, there's a certain center of stillness. Now, in order for us to experience that, we need to practice coming to that point of stillness in our daily life in times when we're not facing adversity. If we just wait for adverse circumstances to practice that, well, we're likely not to be very successful. But if in day-to-day activity we learn, okay, our day-to-day practice of our daily sadhana, daily practice of meditation, we come to the point of stillness. It's easy to understand if you think of keeping the body still, but behind the body, of course, there's the mind And then on a deeper level still, there's also the reactive process of the heart itself that wants to eventually get, or in any situation, to get upset. You might, this of course might seem a little bit theoretical, but think of it this way. I like to, whenever difficulties come to me and I don't know what to do and I don't know how to act, or you don't know what's going to happen next, I try to always remember that there's a higher power at work in this life. And I try to to recall and remember in every circumstances, this higher power, God's power, that I place myself in the hands of God. God ultimately is my cloak of protection, that cloak of calmness that we speak about. That cloak is God. Calmness is a divine aspect of God, and I surround myself in God's presence. And if we can learn to remember that, we see that every situation, no matter how raging the storms are, no matter how big the trials are, how loud the noises is, as Master said, I'll drown their noises, mentally chanting God, God, God. Swami Kriyananda once told a story about how he went to Disneyland in Los Angeles, Southern California, many years ago. He liked to go there, actually. He found it charming and nicely done, Disneyland was. So he went to Disneyland with some friends, and at Disneyland, they have a number of these different entertainment rides. You get into a little boat or perhaps a car, and it goes into a dark space, and it rides on these rails to take you through various adventures. And he was riding on one there was a boat, and he was sitting in the second row of the boat. And he said right in front of him, there was a fellow and his child, with the child there, and they were riding in the boat. And as it went through the dark space and the various, maybe it was Pirates of the Caribbean or one of those rides, they would come to some treacherous situation where, oh my God, disaster was on the horizon. It was just about to happen. And just as it was about to happen, of course, the boat would turn left or turn right. Well, Swamiji was observing the fellow in front of him, the father of the little boy. And the little boy, of course, there was a wheel right there, as if you could guide the boat. And so the little boy was there turning left and right. And whenever we'd come up to a very dangerous situation, the father was so engrossed in the ride that he would say, "Oh, turn the wheel, turn the wheel." And he would get so involved in it, he would reach over and turn the wheel to make sure that the ride missed the waterfall or whatever it was about to go over. But he wasn't doing it because he was doing it because he sort of had this mental impulse or this emotional impulse that it was really going to go over. But of course it wasn't going to go over. The boat was on a track and it was going to miss the waterfall. But the father would forget that in his excitement and the reality of the situation of the ride of the Pirates of the Caribbean. And life is kind of like that, isn't it? Is I try to remember that we're on a certain track underneath. We cannot see. Our boat is going along and we think we're there guiding the boat and driving the boat. And yes, we have to do that. But remember too, on some deeper level, there is a guiding hand that is also there if we invoke that presence in our life. And that's the Guru's presence, God's presence, and that we have to do our part. We do have to turn that wheel to guide it away from adversity. But yet, we must also remember there's a higher power at play also that's going to oversee what ultimately happens. And if we place ourselves, when we say placing ourselves in God's hands, it means not being passive. We can't just sit back and say, well, whatever happens, maybe I'll go over the waterfall, maybe I won't. Paramahansa Yogananda said that's not the right way to approach it. That's taking God for granted. We have to act. So yes, we have to turn the wheel, but ultimately we have to remember that it's God who is in command. And at the same time, while this is happening, when we know that God is ultimately, we're in God's hands, we have to do our part, but we can also enjoy the ride. Yes, we sometimes The ups and downs have their thrills, and sometimes they're a little bit difficult for us. But if we have perspective on a very deep level, we can enjoy that's what's going on. Now, there was a time in Swami Kriyananda's life, he would mention he was going through a very difficult time. Things were just not working, and he almost had the feeling that Guru was abandoning him to some degree, that it not really, but yet he sort of said, Guru, where are you? And because it wasn't working out to the way Swamiji wanted it to work out. And so this was happening in his life for a period of time, and he was a little bit down, feeling down about that. He said, but then he said later, he said, when he looked back, on the surface, everything was a storm. Everything was adverse. Things didn't seem to be working out right. And he was kind of somewhat confused about which way to go, this way or that. He said, but even at those times when he was able to step back a little bit from the tumult of daily life, he realized underneath everything, there was a deep, deep joy. That joy that was always there, ever present. And it was his challenge to always remember that, as it is ours, in the midst of every adverse situation, every difficulty, it doesn't seem it's going to work out. Even when they don't work out as we had wished they would outwardly, we step back and we put ourselves into that frame of mind where we remember, underneath it all, God's in command. We're in God's hands, and there is a deep joy there. And this is the wrapping ourselves in God's presence, wrapping ourselves in calmness. And we find that in that knowledge, in that feeling, in being able to invoke that presence into our lives, that calm stillness that comes in the middle of life storms, we find that then we go forward and we act appropriately. When we can face whatever comes to us in life, come what may, whatever comes of itself, as Swamiji would say, let it come, and I'll be able to respond to it appropriately. Now, one final point. When we find ourselves confronted with difficulties in life, and we find ourselves confronted with the restlessness, the mind becomes very tumultuous, tumult seems to reign supreme within us, the thought comes, and we sometimes read, well, we need to calm the mind. And have you ever been meditating and your mind is just like this? Oh, I need to calm the mind, calm the mind, calm the mind. That's the reason why I cannot be calm, is because the mind is not calm. Well, it's important for us to remember that the mind follows the heart. And as long as the heart is restless, the mind is never going to be restless. So the real source of much of the restlessness of the mind, the inability to focus, the inability to concentrate, if you follow it back, it's actually a restlessness of the heart. That reactive tendency of the heart, the emotion, the deep-seated emotions, or at a very basic level, the impulse of the heart to reach outside of itself for fulfillment in this world. And so long as this deep desire for fulfillment, which all of us have, and as souls we all crave, as long as that desire for fulfillment reaches out into the world to find its fulfillment, we're finding that we will find that our heart can never be totally at rest. And when the heart is never totally at rest, the mind cannot possibly be at rest. This impulse to reach outside of ourselves, to reach out from this divine center with each one of us. And so if we really want to be calm, yes, the mind needs to be calm, and we can do what needs to be done to be able to calm the mind, to watch the breath, to get the breath to be very calm. The mind will calm. But on the deepest level, it's the heart, this tendency of the heart to reach outside. And that will never be satisfied. Lord, Lord, the heart, we're always restless until we find our rest in Thee, is what St. Augustine said. And as long as we seek our fulfillment, our final fulfillment outside of ourselves, outside of God, outside of that deep center of God's reflection within each one of us, we're never going to be able to be totally calm, totally peaceful, totally at rest. And so calmness is impossible in that state. So this is why, when in the midst of, in the battle din of activity, my silent war cry will always be, his master said, God, God, God. And when we have that consciousness, we find that then whatever happens outside of ourselves, whatever happens, and come what may, we can invoke that silent presence of God's presence within and we'll find that calmness reigns, because we come to understand that we're not alone in this world, that we don't need to fight our battles by ourselves. It's a lonely world. And when we think that that we alone are the instrument of our success or our failures in life, but when we bring in the divine friend, the divine presence, that we find that then success or failure, even in failure, there's no such thing really as failure if you have God with you. But yet, even in that perception that, well, I did not yet succeed at this time, then you find that even in that moment, you can find that presence, you'll be guided, you'll feel at rest, and you know that you have God. Because if you have God, what else in the world is needed? This outer world is always going to be, to some degree, a storm. This is the cosmic truth. We live in the storm of Maya. We live in this world of ups and downs, and success is always followed by failure. Heat is followed by cold. And we can ride that gracefully or not, but eventually we find that behind that, there's something still, there's something constant, and there's something that does not change, and that's God's presence. And so let's practice that, practice invoking that and contacting that in our daily meditation. This is why we meditate, is to practice feeling God's presence and stillness within ourselves each day in the midst of a calm, controlled environment of our sadhana, so that when the time comes for us to face that adversity outside, that storm that we find in daily life, good times, bad times, in that moment also we can bring that joy, that feeling of peace, that feeling of calmness to bear at that moment. And we'll find in that moment that we'll be guided, even in the details of our daily living, into the right course in everything that we do. So God bless all of you, and we hope to see you again next week for Living Wisely, Living Well. Joy to you.